The wind howled across the Arizona desert like a wounded animal, carrying dust and desperation in equal measure. Lightning cracked the midnight sky, illuminating the sparse landscape in brief, violent flashes. The year was 1880, and in this remote corner of the untamed West, nature's fury seemed almost gentle compared to the cruelty of men. Jonas Mercer sat alone on his porch, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. At 38, his face was weathered not just by the harsh desert sun, but by memories that cut deeper than any knife. His cabin stood isolated 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, 15 from the nearest town, exactly how he wanted it, how he needed it. The rain began to fall, fat drops that kicked up dust before the parched earth could drink them in. Jonas didn't move to shelter. The rain felt clean against his skin, a rare sensation of purity in a life long stained. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint it might have been imagined. A knock, or perhaps something falling against his door. So soft, so hesitant, it barely registered above the storm's wail. Jonas rose slowly, years of caution hardwired into his movements. His hand reached automatically for the Winchester rifle that rested against the wall, a companion more constant than any human had been for years. He approached the door with the quiet footsteps of a man who'd learned that survival often depended on silence. When he pulled the door open, rifle ready at his side, the sight before him stole his breath more effectively than any punch to the gut. A young woman stood, or rather, swayed on his threshold. Her red hair was matted with blood and dirt, hanging in wet ropes around a face so pale it seemed translucent in the lightning flashes. She wore nothing but torn fabric wrapped around her slender frame, a makeshift covering that might once have been a bedsheet. Blood had soaked through in several places, most alarmingly across her back. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, were glazed with pain but alert enough to register fear when she saw the rifle. She didn't run. She had nowhere to run to, but her body tensed like a cornered animal, preparing for one final, futile struggle. "I'm not clean," she whispered, the words barely audible above the storm. Then her knees buckled, and she pitched forward. Jonas moved without thinking, catching her before she hit the ground. The rifle clattered, forgotten, on the porch as he gathered her slight weight in his arms. She felt impossibly light, as though the storm might snatch her away if he didn't hold tight enough. As he carried her inside, his face betrayed no shock, no confusion, only a grim recognition. This wasn't the first time a broken woman had appeared at his door, though it had been years since the last. He knew what to do, a routine born of experience he wished he didn't have. He laid her gently on his bed, quickly assessing her injuries with practiced eyes. The wound on her back was deep, a knife slash that had barely missed her kidney. It would need stitches. Other cuts and bruises mapped a story of violence across her body that made his jaw clench tight. Jonas moved to the old trunk at the foot of his bed, unlocking it with a key he kept around his neck. Inside lay a medical kit, far more sophisticated than any frontier doctor would possess. Surgical instruments of fine German steel, catgut sutures, tinctures, and powders in carefully labeled bottles. The tools of his former trade, preserved like relics of another life. As he cleaned and began to stitch her wounds, the young woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open for a moment. "He'll kill me if he finds me," she murmured, half-conscious. "No one's going to find you here," Jonas replied, his voice low and steady. "And no one's going to hurt you again." Her eyes, clouded with pain and exhaustion, searched his face for a lie. Finding none, she whispered, "You don't know what he's capable of." A shadow crossed Jonas's face, a darkness that went beyond the flickering lamplight. "I know more than you might think," he said quietly. "Rest now. You're safe." The words felt strange in his mouth, almost foreign. How long had it been since he'd promised anyone safety? How long since he'd believed such a thing was possible? As the woman slipped back into unconsciousness, Jonas continued his work. Each precise stitch was a wordless apology for all the women he hadn't saved. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the cabin's walls, something long dormant in Jonas Mercer stirred to painful life. He didn't yet know her name or her story, but he recognized her wounds, both the ones he could see and the ones hidden beneath the skin. They were wounds he knew intimately, from both sides of the suture needle. And as he worked through the night, the rain beating a relentless rhythm on the roof, Jonas made a silent vow. This time would be different. This woman would not become another ghost to haunt him, another failure carved into his conscience. This time, he would get it right. 2 weeks earlier, the setting sun cast long shadows across the small homestead where Evelyn Hart had spent all 19 years of her life. Once a thriving farm with fields of wheat stretching toward the horizon, it had diminished to a pitiful plot, the land sold off piece by piece to pay her father's mounting debts. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window, her slender fingers working a well-worn cloth over a chipped plate. Through the glass, she could see her father, stumbling up the dirt path from town, his gait unsteady from drink. There had been a time, before her mother died, when her father walked tall and straight, when his laugh could fill a room with warmth. Now he was a hollow shell of that man, eroded by grief and whiskey. She set down the plate and reached for the battered tin where she kept her mother's herbs. Her mother had been known throughout the county for her healing skills, a knowledge passed down through generations of women in her family. Plants remember, her mother used to say, long after people forget. From the tin, Evelyn selected willow bark and valerian root, preparing a tea that might ease her father's inevitable hangover. The door swung open with too much force, bouncing against the wall and adding another dent to the collection. Evie, her father slurred, using the nickname she'd once loved but now endured. Got good news. Evelyn kept her eyes on the kettle. Is that so? Made a deal. Going to fix everything. He collapsed into a chair, the wood groaning under his sudden weight. Cross is willing to clear my debts, all of them. Evelyn's hand stilled on the kettle handle. Gideon Cross was the largest landowner in the county, a widower whose reputation made mothers pull their daughters close when he passed. His fingernails were always clean, his boots always polished, but no amount of external refinement could mask the coldness in his eyes. What kind of deal? She asked, though something in her already knew the answer. Her father wouldn't meet her gaze. He wants a wife, someone to look after his house, someone to give him sons. The kettle began to whistle, a high, panicked sound that matched the ringing in Evelyn's ears. "And you offered me?" she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question, but her father answered anyway, words tumbling out in a desperate jumble. "He'll cancel the debt, Evie. The whole thing. We'll keep what's left of the land. I can start over. Get sober. Make your mother proud." Evelyn turned from the stove, really looking at her father for the first time in months. His once strong face had collapsed into a web of broken veins and premature wrinkles. His eyes, the same green as hers, as her mother's, were bloodshot and pleading. "Mother would never want this," she said quietly. Her father flinched as if she'd struck him. "I got no choice, Evie. If I don't pay Cross by the end of the month, we lose everything. He owns the bank now, too. So, you'll sell your daughter instead of your land." The bitterness in her voice could have curdled milk. "It's a proper marriage," her father insisted, but his eyes slid away from hers. "Legal. In a church and everything." Evelyn laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Cross has buried 3 wives already. Or have you forgotten?" "That was sickness," her father muttered. "Frontier life is hard on women. It's harder on women married to monsters." Her father slammed his fist on the table, making the single plate jump. "Enough. It's decided. The wedding's on Sunday." "Sunday?" Evelyn's voice rose in disbelief. 4 days from now. Cross doesn't like to wait." Her father stood, swaying slightly. "He's sending a dress tomorrow. Be grateful most girls don't get a new dress for their wedding." As he stumbled toward his bedroom, Evelyn remained frozen by the stove. The forgotten kettle now shrieked like a trapped animal. Mechanically, she removed it from the heat. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Her eyes drifted to the small shelf above the stove where her mother's book sat, a hand-bound collection of healing knowledge, recipes, and wisdom. Her mother had pressed it into her hand 7 years ago, as consumption slowly stole her breath. "Knowledge is the path to survival," her mother had whispered. "When all else is taken from you, what remains in your mind cannot be stolen." Evelyn touched the book's worn spine, drawing strength from the connection to her mother. Then, with deliberate movements, she took it down and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. If she was to be sacrificed to pay her father's debts, she would not go empty-handed. That night, as her father's snores rattled through the thin walls, Evelyn sat by the window, looking up at the vast canopy of stars. The same stars her mother had taught her to navigate by, the same stars that had witnessed countless women suffering throughout time. "Give me strength," she whispered to those distant lights. "Give me the courage to survive what's coming." But as dawn approached, bringing Sunday ever closer, Evelyn knew that survival might require more than courage. It might demand a coldness she wasn't sure she possessed, a willingness to do whatever was necessary, even terrible things, to remain alive. She thought of Cross's previous wives, women whose graves lay in neat rows behind the grand house on the hill, women who had entered that house alive and left it in pine boxes. Evelyn pressed her hand against the window pane, the glass cool against her palm. "I will not be next," she promised the night. "I will not disappear." Sunday arrived with cruel swiftness, dawning clear and bright, as if mocking Evelyn's dark circumstances. The dress Cross sent was fine silk and pale blue, with pearl buttons and lace trim, a costume for the macabre theater piece her life had become. As promised, the ceremony took place in the small wooden church at the edge of town. No friends or well-wishers attended. Only the bare minimum required by law were present. The minister, visibly uncomfortable but unwilling to refuse the county's wealthiest resident. Her father, sober for the occasion, but gray-faced with what might have been regret. And Deputy Sheriff Elias Ward, whose presence Cross had specifically requested to ensure the legality of the proceedings. Deputy Ward was new to the area, having arrived only months ago from somewhere back east. He stood ramrod straight in his pressed uniform, dark eyes watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. When his gaze met Evelyn's, something flickered there, a flash of sympathy, quickly masked. Gideon Cross himself cut an imposing figure at 55, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading his dark hair. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. His clothes were Eastern cut, expensive, his boots polished to a mirror shine. The long scar that ran from his right temple to jawline, a souvenir from a duel that had first brought him under Jonas Mercer's surgical care years ago, did nothing to diminish his commanding presence. Throughout the brief ceremony, Cross's hand rested possessively on Evelyn's lower back, his fingers pressing just hard enough to promise pain if she faltered in her responses. She spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice that betrayed none of the revulsion churning in her stomach. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Cross's kiss was brief, but claiming a brand of ownership more than an expression of affection. His eyes, pale blue and coldly assessing, studied her reaction with clinical interest. "My previous wives were disappointing," he murmured for her ears alone as they signed the marriage certificate. "I trust you'll prove more resilient." The journey to Cross's estate was made in silence. The house itself was the grandest in the county, 2 stories of imposing white-painted wood with a wraparound porch and tall windows that stared out like vacant eyes. Servants, tight-lipped and careful not to meet Evelyn's gaze, showed her to the bedroom she would share with her new husband. "Mr. Cross will join you after dinner," the housekeeper informed her, a woman whose pinched expression suggested she'd witnessed this scene before. "He expects you to be prepared." Left alone, Evelyn explored the room that was now her gilded cage. It was lavishly appointed with heavy furniture, thick carpets, and silk curtains, all speaking of wealth but lacking any warmth or personality. On the dresser sat a silver-framed photograph of a stern-faced woman, presumably Cross's first wife. Evelyn wondered if the other wives had been given the courtesy of removing their predecessor's portrait, or if Cross enjoyed the reminder of his collection. As dusk fell, she heard Cross's heavy tread on the stairs. She sat on the edge of the bed, back straight, hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl awaiting punishment. The door opened without a knock. Cross entered, already in his nightshirt, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. His eyes raked over her with the detached interest of a man appraising livestock. "You're a pretty thing," he said, taking a long swallow from his glass. "Your mother was pretty, too." before the consumption took her. I considered her once, before she chose your father. He set the glass down and began unbuttoning his nightshirt. I always get what I want eventually. What followed was brutality disguised as marital rights. Cross took what he considered his due with methodical efficiency, unmoved by Evelyn's pain or silent tears. When he finished, he rolled away and poured himself another drink from the decanter by the bed. "You'll give me a son," he stated, as if his words alone could ensure it. "The others failed, but you come from hardy stock." Evelyn lay motionless, feeling blood trickle down her thigh, mingling with other fluids she refused to name. "The others?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible. Cross's lips curled in a smile that never reached his eyes. "My wives, weak women, all of them. Couldn't carry a son to term." The whiskey had loosened his tongue, and something like satisfaction colored his voice. 6 of them now, all disappointments. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Cross had been married 3 times. Officially, the graves behind the house confirmed it, which meant, "What happened to the others?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Cross's gaze turned distant, almost dreamy. "They served their purpose until they proved useless. Then they went away." He drained his glass and set it down with a heavy thud. "Women are easily replaced. Remember that." He fell asleep soon after, his breathing deep and even, untroubled by conscience or memory. Evelyn lay awake beside him, her body aching but her mind racing with terrible clarity. Cross had all but confessed to murdering women who had failed to give him a son. Women whose bodies likely lay in unmarked graves somewhere on his vast property. And now she wore the same gold band that had adorned their fingers, slept in the same bed where they had suffered, and faced the same fate if she failed to produce the heir he demanded. She was not Cross's wife. She was his next victim unless she found a way to escape. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Evelyn made her decision. She would not wait to become another disappeared woman, another secret buried on Cross's land. She would act now, while she still had the strength and will to fight. Carefully, she slid from the bed, wincing at the pain between her legs. Cross didn't stir, deep in an alcohol-induced slumber. From her discarded dress, she retrieved her mother's book, hidden in a secret pocket she'd sewn herself. With trembling fingers, she turned to the section on sleeping drafts and sedatives. Her mother's neat handwriting detailed the preparation of a tincture using herbs Evelyn had noticed growing in Cross's kitchen garden: valerian, hops, and a particularly potent mushroom that could, in the right dose, render a man unconscious for hours. Time was short. Cross would wake soon, and the household staff would begin their daily routines. If she was to act, it must be now. With one last look at the sleeping man who had purchased her like cattle, Evelyn slipped from the room, her bare feet silent on the polished floors, moving toward the kitchen and the garden beyond, toward freedom or death. At this point, she hardly cared which, so long as she chose her own fate. The kitchen garden lay quiet in the pre-dawn light, dew glistening on leaves like tears. Evelyn moved with purposeful haste, gathering the herbs she needed. Valerian root, hops, and with cautious fingers, the small brown mushrooms growing in the shadowed corner beneath the oak tree. Her mother's warnings echoed in her mind. Too little would fail. Too much would kill. She needed Cross unconscious, not dead, at least not yet. A dead man would be discovered quickly. A sleeping one bought her precious time. In the empty kitchen, Evelyn worked swiftly, crushing the plants with a mortar and pestle, adding water heated over the carefully stoked stove. The servants wouldn't arrive for another hour. Cross preferred his household staff to live in town rather than on his property, a preference that now worked in her favor. As the mixture steeped, she explored the kitchen, gathering supplies: a small knife, dried meat, hard bread, a canteen for water. Each item went into a flour sack she found hanging by the pantry. It wasn't much, but it might keep her alive in the desert long enough to reach. Where? She had nowhere to go, no allies to turn to. Her father had sold her. The law would return her to her husband. She was alone. The realization nearly buckled her knees, but Evelyn forced herself to remain standing. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She strained the herbal concoction into a cup, added honey to mask the bitter taste, and carried it upstairs with steady hands. Cross still slept, snoring softly, one arm flung across the space where she should have been. Evelyn set the cup on his bedside table, then deliberately knocked over his empty whiskey glass. The noise did its work. Cross stirred, eyes opening to narrow slits. "What time is it?" he mumbled, voice thick with sleep and lingering alcohol. "Early yet," Evelyn answered softly. "I brought you something for your head. You drank a lot last night." Cross pushed himself up on one elbow, eyeing the steaming cup suspiciously. "What is it?" "An old family remedy," she said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "My mother was known for her healing skills." At the mention of her mother, Cross's expression softened fractionally. She did have a way with herbs. Half the county came to her when they were ailing. He took the cup, sniffed it, then took a cautious sip. Finding the taste acceptable, he drank deeply. "It's good," he admitted, surprise coloring his voice. "Sweet the honey," Evelyn explained, taking the empty cup from his hands. "Rest now. I'll bring breakfast later." Cross nodded, already feeling the heaviness in his limbs, the pleasant fogginess creeping into his mind. He settled back against the pillows, eyes drifting closed. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into the rhythmic pattern of deep sleep. Evelyn watched him for a moment, ensuring the draft had taken effect. Satisfied, she moved quickly, changing from her nightgown into the simplest dress she could find in the wardrobe, a brown cotton work dress that would draw less attention than her blue wedding silk. She tied back her red hair with a plain ribbon and covered it with a bonnet. Before leaving, she needed money. The journey ahead would be impossible without it. Hesitantly, she approached Cross's desk in the corner of the bedroom. The top drawer was locked, but the key hung on a chain around Cross's neck. With trembling fingers, she lifted the chain over his head, half expecting him to wake at any moment. He didn't stir. The drawer contained what she'd hoped for, a cash box with several banknotes and gold coins. Evelyn took only what she thought she'd need, reasoning that too much missing money would raise immediate alarm. As she was about to close the drawer, another item caught her eye. A small leather-bound book, its spine cracked from frequent use. Curiosity overcoming caution, Evelyn opened it. The first page bore a single name in Cross's precise handwriting. Margaret Cross, 1863 to 1865. The next several pages detailed Margaret's failures to conceive, her increasingly hysteric behavior, and finally a cold account of her unfortunate accident while riding alone. The next section began with Eleanor Cross, 1866 to 1868, followed by Sarah Cross, 1869 to 1870, and on through women whose names had never appeared on official marriage documents or tombstones. Each account ended the same way, with an accident or sudden illness after the woman failed to produce a male heir. Horror rooted Evelyn to the spot as she realized she held the evidence of at least 6 murders, meticulously documented by the killer himself. Cross hadn't just hinted at killing his wives. He'd kept a grotesque ledger of his crimes. She was so absorbed in this discovery that she didn't hear the change in Cross's breathing, didn't notice him stirring until his voice, slurred but unmistakably alert, broke the silence. "What are you doing?" Evelyn's head snapped up. Cross was half sitting, fighting against the sedative, his eyes struggling to focus on her and the book in her hands. The draft had been strong, but not strong enough, or perhaps his body, accustomed to alcohol, metabolized it faster than she'd anticipated. "You shouldn't be awake," she said, taking an instinctive step backward. Cross's gaze fell to the open drawer, the cash box, the diary in her hands. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a cold rage that cut through the fog of the sedative. "You little thief," he snarled, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He stood unsteadily, but the threat in his posture was unmistakable. "What did you give me?" Evelyn clutched the diary to her chest. "I know what you did to them," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "All of them." Cross lunged toward her, movement slowed by the drug but driven by fury. Evelyn darted away, but the room offered limited space for evasion. She feinted toward the door, then changed direction as Cross moved to intercept her. In the process, her elbow struck the bedside table, sending the ceramic cup crashing to the floor. The noise seemed to enrage Cross further. He reached beneath the mattress and pulled out a hunting knife, its blade gleaming in the early morning light. "I had such hopes for you," he said, advancing slowly, using the furniture to steady himself. "But you're just like the others, disobedient, ungrateful." Evelyn backed toward the window, mind racing. She still held the diary evidence of his crimes, but it would do her no good if she didn't survive to show it to someone. And who would believe her word against that of Gideon Cross, the richest man in the county? When Cross was just an arm's length away, knife raised, Evelyn threw the diary at his face. The unexpected move caught him off guard, and he reflexively raised his hands to block it, giving her the opening she needed. She shoved past him with all her strength, sending him staggering into the bedpost. Cross recovered quickly, slashing with the knife as she fled. Pain blazed across her back as the blade connected, slicing through dress and skin. Evelyn cried out but didn't stop, adrenaline propelling her forward. She reached the door, wrenched it open, and ran for the stairs. Behind her, Cross's footsteps were uneven but determined. At the top of the staircase, he caught the back of her dress. Evelyn twisted violently, fabric tearing as she broke free, but the sudden movement unbalanced both of them on the narrow landing. Cross windmilled his arms, the knife still clutched in one hand, before pitching forward down the stairs. He tumbled awkwardly, a sickening crack sounding as his head struck the banister. He came to rest at the bottom, motionless, blood pooling beneath his skull. Evelyn froze, certain she'd killed him, but after a moment, a low groan escaped Cross's lips. He was alive, but badly injured and unconscious, which was all that mattered. She didn't wait to see if he would wake. Retrieving her small bundle of supplies from the kitchen, Evelyn slipped out the back door into the brightening day. The wound on her back throbbed with each heartbeat, warm blood soaking into her torn dress. She needed to bind it, but there was no time. Not here. Not this close to the house. She cut through the orchard, keeping to the shadows, and crossed the south pasture, where the ground was harder, less likely to hold footprints. At the property line, she paused to look back at the grand white house that had nearly become her tomb. From this distance, it looked peaceful, respectable, its dark secrets hidden behind gleaming windows and fresh paint. Turning away, Evelyn faced the desert that stretched between Cross's land and the next settlement. 15 miles of harsh terrain lay ahead, a journey that would be challenging for a healthy person with proper supplies. For a wounded woman with only what she could carry, it might well be a death sentence. But staying meant certain death once Cross recovered. At least the desert offered a chance, however slim. Drawing a deep breath, Evelyn pulled her bonnet lower to shade her face and took her first steps into the wilderness. The sun climbed higher, promising a scorching day ahead. Blood continued to seep from the wound on her back, but she forced herself to keep moving, one foot in front of the other. She whispered to herself, her mother's words becoming a mantra. The body can endure more than the mind believes possible. She would walk until she reached safety, or until the desert claimed her. Either way, she would die free, not as another entry in Gideon Cross's macabre diary. Evelyn had no clear memory of how she found Jonas Mercer's cabin. The last hours of her journey blurred into a haze of thirst, pain, and determination. The wound on her back had stopped bleeding only because she had no more fluid to spare. Her lips were cracked, her skin burned by the merciless sun. She had walked through the day and into the night, guided only by stars and desperation. When she saw the faint glow of a lamp through the darkness, she thought it might be a hallucination, a cruel trick of her failing mind. But as she stumbled closer, the silhouette of a small cabin emerged solid and real. Gathering her last reserves of strength, Evelyn dragged herself to the door and raised her hand to knock. The sound seemed pathetically feeble to her ears, but it was all she could manage before darkness claimed her. Now, as consciousness returned, Evelyn found herself lying on a strange bed, a cool cloth on her forehead. The pain in her back had dulled to a persistent throb, and the worst of her thirst had been quenched. Someone had tended her wounds and given her water while she slept. The room was simply furnished but clean, a far cry from Cross's opulent bedroom. A kerosene lamp cast a warm glow over plain wooden walls hung with dried herbs and a few simple tools. The bed beneath her was narrow but comfortable, the sheets worn but freshly laundered. Cautiously, Evelyn tried to sit up. Pain lanced through her back, drawing a gasp from her dry lips. "I wouldn't do that just yet," came a deep voice from the doorway. Evelyn's head turned sharply, sending the room spinning. When her vision cleared, she saw a tall man framed in the doorway, holding a steaming mug in his hand. Instinctively, she pulled the blanket higher, shrinking back against the headboard. Despite the pain the movement caused, the man remained where he was, making no move to approach. "The knife wound on your back needed 16 stitches, he said matter-of-factly. "You've also got severe sunburn, dehydration, and enough bruises to suggest you've been through hell before you ever hit the desert." His bluntness was oddly reassuring. There was no pity in his voice, just a clinical assessment. Still, Evelyn remained wary. Men's kindness, in her experience, came with expectations. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice a rasp. "Jonas Mercer." He held up the mug. Willow bark tea for the pain and fever. When she didn't respond, he set the mug on a small table near the door and stepped back. "It's not poisoned. If I wanted to hurt you, I'd have done it while you were unconscious for the past 2 days. 2 days? Evelyn's hand flew to her throat in alarm. Jonas nodded. "You've been in and out fever from infection. I cleaned the wound as best I could, but you'd been walking in desert dirt for hours before you got here." As he spoke, Evelyn studied him more carefully. Jonas Mercer was perhaps in his late 30s, with the weathered look of someone who lived hard in the open air. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a deep brown that seemed to hold shadows no lamp could dispel. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle, and dark trousers worn smooth at the knees. No wedding ring, no visible weapons, though that meant little in a land where most men kept firearms within easy reach. "Thank you," she said finally, the words feeling inadequate. "For helping me." Jonas acknowledged this with a slight nod. "Can you manage the tea on your own? Or do you need help sitting up?" Evelyn's pride warred with practicality. She was weak, and the mug looked heavy. "Help," she admitted reluctantly. "Please." Jonas approached slowly, telegraphing his movements as one might with a skittish horse. He slid one arm behind her shoulders and gently eased her into a sitting position, arranging pillows to support her back without putting pressure on the wound. His touch was impersonal, efficient, the touch of someone used to handling the injured. Once she was settled, he retrieved the mug and placed it in her hands, which trembled slightly from weakness. The warmth seeped into her palms, oddly comforting. "Small sips," he advised, stepping back to give her space. "Your stomach needs to remember how to work." Evelyn obeyed, taking a tentative sip of the bitter brew. It had been sweetened with honey, making it more palatable. As the warm liquid coursed down her throat, she became aware of how she must appear to this stranger. Filthy, wounded, dressed in torn, blood-stained clothing. "I can't pay you," she said abruptly, "for the care or the medicine." Something that might have been amusement flickered in Jonas's eyes. "I'm not a doctor. Not anymore. And I don't live out here because I need money." The statement raised more questions than it answered, but Evelyn was too exhausted to pursue them. Instead, she asked the most pressing question, "Where am I?" "About 20 miles northeast of Redemption," Jonas replied, referring to the nearest town. "Middle of nowhere, which I suspect suits your purposes just fine." At the mention of Redemption, Evelyn tensed, nearly spilling the tea. It was the town where Cross conducted most of his business, where he had influence with local law enforcement. Jonas noticed her reaction, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You running from someone in Redemption?" he asked. His tone casual, but his gaze sharp. Evelyn hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. This man had saved her life, but that didn't mean she could trust him. For all she knew, he might be acquainted with. Cross might even be sympathetic to him. "My husband," she admitted finally, deciding a partial truth was safer than an obvious lie. He's not a kind man. Jonas's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. Most men who send their wives fleeing into the desert with knife wounds aren't, he said dryly. Does this unkind husband have a name? The question seemed innocent enough, but Evelyn sensed a tension in Jonas that hadn't been there before. She took another sip of tea, buying time to think. If Cross had connections in redemption, might he know this reclusive ex-doctor? Gideon, she said finally, watching Jonas's face carefully. Gideon Cross. The effect of the name was immediate and startling. Jonas went perfectly still, like a predator that's caught a scent on the wind. The change was subtle. He didn't move, didn't speak, but the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Cross, he repeated, the name falling from his lips like a stone. You're married to Gideon Cross. It wasn't a question, but Evelyn nodded anyway, suddenly cold despite the warm mug in her hands. You know him. Jonas's laugh was short and without humor. You could say that. He turned away, moving to the window to look out at the gathering dusk. When he spoke again, his voice was distant, as if he was talking to himself more than to her. Of all the cabins in all the desert, you had to stumble into mine. Evelyn set down the mug, her mouth suddenly dry despite the tea. Who are you? She asked again, this time with an edge of fear. How do you know Cross? Jonas turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. I saved his life once, during a gunfight in Redemption. I was the doctor who dug the bullet out of his chest and stitched him up, his mouth twisted in a grim smile. One of the great regrets of my medical career. Relief washed over Evelyn, followed quickly by confusion. If Jonas had saved Cross's life, why did he speak of it with such bitterness? And why had he left medicine to live in isolation? Before she could frame these questions, Jonas continued, his voice taking on a clinical detachment. Cross's wound is infected by now. He'll have sent men looking for you, but they'll be searching south and west toward the larger settlements. No one comes this way except those who want to be forgotten. He met her eyes directly. Is that what you want? Evelyn to be forgotten? The use of her name startled her. She hadn't told him what she was called. Then she remembered the fever, the days of unconsciousness. She must have spoken her name during her delirium. I want to be safe, she answered truthfully. I want to live. Jonas nodded, as if her answer confirmed something for him. Then rest. Regain your strength. No one will find you here. He moved toward the door, then paused. Cross believes you know something. Something in a book. You mentioned it during your fever. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Had she revealed everything in her delirium? His diary? She whispered. He killed them. His other wives, at least 6 of them. He wrote it all down. Jonas's expression didn't register surprise, only a grim vindication. I suspected as much, he said quietly. But suspicion isn't proof. I saw the proof, Evelyn insisted. I read it in his own hand, but I couldn't bring the diary with me. I had to leave it behind when he attacked me. Jonas was silent for a long moment, considering her words. Finally, he nodded once, decisively. We'll talk more when you're stronger. For now, sleep. You're safe here. As he reached for the door handle, Evelyn called out, Mr. Mercer. He paused, looking back at her. Thank you, she said simply, for believing me. Something shifted in Jonas's shadowed eyes, not softening exactly, but a recognition, an acknowledgement of shared understanding. Then he was gone, closing the door quietly behind him. Alone in the small room, Evelyn stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of this strange turn of events. She had fled one man's house only to land in another's trading, a grand prison for a humble sanctuary. Jonas Mercer clearly had his own history with Cross, his own reasons for living apart from society. Whether those reasons would ultimately help or harm her remained to be seen. But for now, exhaustion claimed her, pulling her back into sleep as the willow bark tea dulled her pain and the desert wind sang a lonely lullaby outside the cabin walls. The first rays of dawn filtered through the small window, painting golden stripes across the rough wooden floor. Evelyn woke slowly, her body stiff, but her mind clearer than it had been in days. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving her weak but alert. Cautiously, she tested her limbs, cataloging her injuries. The wound on her back pulled painfully when she moved, but the fierce burning of infection had subsided. Her sunburned skin felt tight and tender, and various bruises, some from cross, others from her desperate desert journey, mapped a constellation of pain across her body. But she was alive, and for the moment, safe. From beyond the closed door came the quiet sounds of movement. The clink of metal, the soft scrape of a chair, the muted thud of footsteps. Jonas Mercer was awake and moving about the cabin. Evelyn's gaze fell on a neatly folded pile of clothing placed on the small table near the bed. A man's shirt far too large for her, and a pair of trousers that had been taken in with rough but serviceable stitches. Beside them sat a basin of fresh water, a cloth, and a small piece of soap that smelled faintly of sage. The gesture was both thoughtful and impersonal, allowing her to clean up and change without assistance or awkward conversation. It spoke of a man accustomed to considering practical needs without fuss, and perhaps one who understood the value of dignity to someone who had been stripped of everything else. Moving gingerly, Evelyn managed to wash and change, the simple act restoring some sense of control over her circumstances. The shirt hung loosely on her frame, but the clean fabric against her skin felt like a luxury after days in her torn, bloodied dress. A soft knock at the door made her start. "Yes," she called, her voice stronger than the previous day. "There's food," came Jonas's reply. "When you're ready." No pressure to hurry, no demand that she join him, just a statement of fact, and the freedom to choose her response. Evelyn found herself unexpectedly moved by this small courtesy. "I'll be out shortly," she answered. The main room of the cabin was larger than she'd expected, with an open layout that combined kitchen, dining area, and living space. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, currently home to a cast-iron pot that emitted the savory smell of something cooking. Bookshelves lined another wall, crammed with volumes whose spines showed the wear of frequent reading. A sturdy table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the room, already set with 2 plates and mugs. Jonas stood at the stove, his back to her as he stirred whatever was in the pot. Without turning, he said, "Sit wherever you like. It's just porridge, but there's honey if you want it sweet." Evelyn chose the chair that allowed her to keep both Jonas and the door in view, a defensive position that didn't escape her host's notice. A brief, knowing glance was his only acknowledgement as he ladled porridge into bowls and placed one before her. "Thank you," she said, the words becoming a refrain between them. "For the clothes as well." Jonas nodded, taking the seat across from her. "They were my wife's," he said matter-of-factly. "She was taller than you, but they'll do until yours can be mended." The casual mention of a wife raised immediate questions, but the past tense and the absence of any female presence in the cabin provided its own answer. Evelyn kept her eyes on her bowl, not wanting to pry into what was clearly a painful topic. They ate in silence for several minutes. The porridge was plain but filling, and Evelyn found her appetite returning with unexpected force. She was halfway through her bowl before she realized Jonas had been watching her with the assessing eye of someone gauging a patient's recovery. "Your color's better," he observed. "Fever's gone. How's the pain?" "Manageable," she replied, not wanting to appear weak. Jonas's raised eyebrows suggested he saw through the brave front. "There's more willow bark tea if it's not." Evelyn shook her head. "I'd rather have a clear mind." This earned her a nod of approval. "Smart. Pain reminds us we're still alive." He pushed back from the table and moved to a cabinet, returning with a small jar. "For your back. It's a salve, helps prevent scarring and keeps the stitches from pulling." Evelyn took the jar hesitantly. "I can't reach it myself." "I know," Jonas said, his tone remaining clinical. "I changed the bandage while you were fevered, but you're awake now, which means it's your choice. I can help, or you can manage as best you can, or it can wait until you trust me more." He met her eyes directly. "I understand caution, Evelyn. I won't be offended if you refuse." The frank acknowledgement of her fear without judgment or impatience loosened something tight in Evelyn's chest. This man had saved her life, tended her wounds, and offered shelter without asking anything in return. he had also given her something precious. Few men ever had the right to say no. "I'd appreciate your help," she decided, "but not just yet." Jonas accepted this with an easy nod, returning to his porridge without comment. As they continued eating, Evelyn studied him surreptitiously. In the clear light of morning, she could see details missed in the previous evening's dim lamplight: the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the careful precision of his movements that spoke of someone always in control. "You have questions," he said suddenly, setting down his spoon. "Ask them." Startled by his directness, Evelyn hesitated. "It's not my place to pry. You're in my home, wearing my dead wife's clothes, after fleeing a man I once saved from a bullet," Jonas pointed out dryly. "I think we're past the point of polite distance." Put that way, her reticence did seem absurd. Evelyn straightened in her chair, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her stitches. "How do you know Cross beyond saving his life? I mean, professionally at first. I was the only doctor in Redemption for nearly 5 years. Cross was shot in a dispute over a poker game. The man who put the bullet in him claimed Cross had cheated." Jonas's mouth tightened. "The shooter was found hanging from a cottonwood tree later. Official ruling was suicide, but everyone knew better." "And you? What did you think?" "I think Cross never forgave a slight and never let the law interfere with his version of justice." Jonas's eyes grew distant. "After that, I saw him mostly at social functions. Redemption was a small town, and as the doctor, I was invited everywhere. Cross made a point of being friendly, said I'd earned his gratitude. I didn't trust it, but in those days, his goodwill was valuable currency." Evelyn sensed there was more to the story, much more, but Jonas's expression had closed, making it clear he'd shared all he intended to for now. She shifted to another question. "You said you're not a doctor anymore. Why?" "Because I failed at the most fundamental duty of medicine," he replied flatly. "Do no harm." He rose abruptly, gathering their empty bowls. "That's enough questions for now. You need rest, and I have chores." The wall between them was suddenly back in place, higher and more formidable than before. Jonas moved to the sink, his back a rigid line that discouraged further conversation. Evelyn knew she should leave it alone, should respect the boundaries he'd clearly drawn. But something in his posture, the careful way he controlled his movements, reminded her of herself, of the way she'd learned to contain her own pain to function despite it. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "whatever happened, thank you for helping me anyway." Jonas's hands stilled on the dishes. For a long moment he didn't move or speak. Then, without turning, he said, "Jonas, just Jonas. Mr. Mercer was my father, and he was a cold bastard I'd rather not be reminded of." It was a small concession, a tiny crack in the wall, but Evelyn recognized it for the gesture it was. "Jonas, then," she agreed. "And I'm Evelyn, not Mrs. Cross. That name was forced on me, and I'd rather not wear it any longer than I have to." Now he did turn, studying her with those shadowed eyes. "Fair enough, Evelyn." A ghost of a smile touched his lips there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if you're up to it, we'll see about making you useful around here. I didn't save your life so you could become another invalid I have to tend." The gruff statement held no real sting, and Evelyn found herself smiling in response. "I've never been an invalid in my life, and I don't intend to start now." "Good." Jonas nodded decisively. "Because surviving Cross was the easy part. Living afterward, that's where the real work begins." With that cryptic statement, he strode to the door, pausing only to retrieve a wide-brimmed hat from a hook on the wall. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything urgent. Otherwise, make yourself at home. Just stay inside, no need to advertise your presence to anyone passing by." After he left, Evelyn remained at the table, considering his words. The easy part, running for her life through the desert with a knife wound in her back, had been far from easy. But perhaps Jonas spoke from experience. He clearly had his own history with Cross, his own wounds that went deeper than skin. Curious about the man who had saved her, Evelyn rose carefully and moved to the bookshelves. The collection was eclectic. Medical texts alongside philosophy, Shakespeare beside books on botany and animal husbandry. Several volumes on regional plants and their medicinal properties caught her eye, reminding her of her mother's similar interests. As she ran her fingers along the spines, a book fell from where it had been precariously balanced atop a stack. It landed open on the floor, revealing itself to be not a book, but a photograph album. Evelyn bent to retrieve it, wincing at the pull on her stitches. The page showed a formal portrait of a young couple. Jonas, perhaps 10 years younger, standing beside a tall, elegant woman with dark hair piled high in the fashion of the time. His arm was around her waist, and though the photograph required stillness, there was a sense of connection between them, of mutual pride and affection. Evelyn knew she should close the album, replace it on the shelf, and respect Jonas's privacy. Instead, she turned the page. Another photograph showed the same woman, now visibly pregnant, sitting in a garden. The next featured Jonas holding a small bundle, his expression transformed by a smile that reached his eyes that, in the photograph, held none of the shadows that now seemed permanent fixtures. Eleanor Margaret Mercer, born the 12th of April, 1870, read the careful inscription beneath. A child. Jonas had had a wife and child, and now he lived alone in a remote cabin, no longer practicing medicine, with ghosts in his eyes and a bitterness that went bone deep. Evelyn closed the album gently and returned it to the shelf, a weight settling in her chest. Whatever tragedy had befallen Jonas's family, it clearly connected somehow to Gideon Cross enough that the mere mention of the man's name had transformed Jonas's demeanor from clinical detachment to barely contained rage. She moved to the window, watching as Jonas emerged from the barn, leading a dappled gray horse to a small corral. His movements were efficient, practiced a man going through the motions of a life that continued even after the heart had been cut out of it. In that moment, Evelyn recognized a fundamental truth. She and Jonas were mirrors of each other, both broken by circumstances beyond their control, both fighting to forge a path forward from the wreckage. The wall between them wasn't just his creation or hers, it was built of shared pain, of parallel wounds that hadn't yet healed. And perhaps, she thought as she watched him work, that shared understanding might eventually become a bridge instead of a barrier. For 3 days, Evelyn and Jonas established a cautious routine around each other. Mornings began with a simple breakfast, followed by Jonas checking her wound and changing the bandage, a process that had become less uncomfortable as trust slowly built between them. Evelyn spent her days regaining strength, first moving around the cabin, then graduating to short walks in the enclosed yard behind the house. Jonas remained reserved but not unkind, answering her questions about the ranch and his daily work, but deftly avoiding any topic that strayed too close to his past. He taught her the layout of the small homestead, the main cabin, the barn that housed his horse and 2 milk cows, the chicken coop, and the workshop where he repaired tools intact. A vegetable garden neatly tended despite the harsh conditions provided fresh produce that supplemented their meals of preserved foods. By the 4th day, Evelyn insisted on helping with chores, starting with the simple task of gathering eggs and watering the garden. Jonas watched her with a doctor's assessing eye, stepping in when he saw her flagging, but otherwise allowing her the dignity of contributing. It was while she was hanging laundry in the yard, the desert sun hot on her back despite the early hour, that Evelyn first heard approaching hoofbeats. Her hands froze on the damp shirt she'd been about to pin to the line, heart suddenly hammering in her chest. Jonas appeared in the doorway of the workshop, his expression grim. "Inside," he said quietly, nodding toward the cabin. Now, Evelyn didn't need to be told twice. She abandoned the laundry and moved quickly to the cabin, slipping inside and closing the door behind her. Through the window, she watched as Jonas calmly picked up a pitchfork and continued the work he'd been doing in the barn, positioning himself so he could see the approaching rider. The man who rode into the yard was dust-covered and trail-worn. With the hard eyes of someone used to violence, he sat easily in the saddle, one hand resting near the pistol at his hip, not a direct threat, but a reminder of its presence. Evelyn recognized him immediately. Travis Holt, Cross's foreman and trusted enforcer. "Mercer," Holt called, reining his horse to a stop. "Been a while." Jonas leaned on the pitchfork, his posture deliberately casual. "Holt, what brings you out this way, kind of far from Cross's regular territory?" Holt dismounted, stretching his back with a grimace. "Looking for someone. Thought you might have seen her, being out here where folks pass through heading north. Not much traffic out this way," Jonas replied evenly. "Most travelers stick to the main roads." "This one wouldn't," Holt said, his eyes scanning the yard with practiced attention. "Young woman, red hair, probably hurt. Stole money from Mr. Cross and tried to kill him before she ran." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Cross had survived the fall down the stairs and was now painting her as the aggressor, a thief, and would-be murderer. It was a clever strategy. No one would question why he wanted her found, and few would sympathize with her if they believed his version of events. Outside, Jonas's expression didn't change. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description. Desert tends to kill those who don't know what they're doing. She might not have made it this far." Holt spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Maybe. Maybe not. Girl's got her mother's stubbornness, from what I hear. Her mother was a tough one before the consumption got her." At the mention of her mother, Evelyn's fingers dug into the windowsill. How dare this man speak her mother's name, as if he had any right to invoke her memory. "Heart," Jonas echoed, something flickering briefly across his face. "Her mother's daughter. I thought she married a farmer from up north." The casual question was masterfully posed, seeking information while appearing only mildly interested. Holt didn't seem to notice the strategy. "Nah, old man lost his farm in 2073. Been drinking himself stupid ever since. Sold the girl to Cross to clear his debts." Holt shrugged, as if the transaction was unremarkable. "Legal wedding and everything, but the girl turned out ungrateful. Mr. Cross is offering $500 for her return. Alive," he emphasized. "He's particular about that. Must want her pretty badly," Jonas observed, his tone neutral. Holt's mouth twisted in an ugly smile. "She knows things, read things she shouldn't have. And Mr. N.A. Cross doesn't like leaving loose ends." "I'll keep an eye out," Jonas said, matching Holt's casual tone. "Though if I were a woman running from Cross, I'd head for California or maybe up to Colorado. Lots of mining camps where a woman could disappear." Holt studied Jonas for a long moment, clearly weighing his words. "You know, some folks in town still wonder why you left Redemption so sudden-like, right after that fire that took your family." The atmosphere shifted, tension crackling like lightning about to strike. Jonas's knuckles whitened on the pitchfork handle, but his voice remained steady. "Some tragedies a man can't live with, Holt. Some towns hold too many memories." Sure. Holt nodded, but his eyes were calculating. "Just seems strange is all. Respected doctor one day, gone the next. Left a lot of patients wondering. I stopped being a doctor the night my wife and daughter burned to death," Jonas said flatly. "Now, unless you've got medical needs I can't help with, you should move on. Daylight's burning, and you've got a long ride back to Cross's place." The dismissal was clear, and after a tense moment, Holt nodded. "I'll be on my way. But if you do see that Hart girl, you'd be wise to send word. Mr. Cross doesn't forget those who cross him." He mounted his horse with the ease of a man who lived in the saddle, or those who help others cross him. "I'll keep that in mind," Jonas replied evenly. Holt turned his horse but paused before riding off. "One more thing, Mercer. The girl's in a family way early stages, but Cross is sure of it. Says that's why she ran, trying to deny him his rightful heir. So if you do see her, handle her careful-like. Cross wants what's his." With that parting shot, Holt spurred his horse and rode out, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Jonas remained motionless, watching until the rider disappeared over the rise. Only then did he set down the pitchfork and head for the cabin, his stride purposeful. Inside, Evelyn had backed away from the window, one hand pressed against her stomach in unconscious protection. Pregnant? It wasn't possible. Or was it? Cross had forced himself on her on their wedding night, and though the memory was a blur of pain and humiliation, the timing aligned with Holt's claim. The door opened, and Jonas entered, his expression unreadable. You heard? Evelyn nodded, unable to form words past the lump in her throat. Is it true? He asked, his voice gentle but probing. Evelyn's mind raced. Could she be carrying Cross's child? The thought filled her with dread, complicating her escape. If true, running would risk not just her life, but an innocent one's. Yet staying meant facing Cross's wrath, his claim over the heir he so desperately craved. I don't know, she admitted, tears stinging her eyes. But if it is, I can't let him have it. I won't raise a child in that monster's shadow. Jonas nodded, understanding the Mothworn inner turmoil. Then we prepare. You need to learn to defend yourself properly. Over the next days, Jonas taught her to shoot, handling the revolver, aiming steady, reloading under pressure. Evelyn's hands shook at first, but determination hardened her resolve. She practiced in the yard, the crack of gunfire echoing across the desert like a declaration of war. As they trained, Evelyn probed deeper into Jonas's past. One evening by the fire, he finally opened up. Cross caused the fire that killed my wife and daughter. Indirectly, but his hand was in it, a dispute over land, a warning gone wrong. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. That's why I left medicine, left everything, to wait for a chance at justice. Evelyn shared her own horrors, the forced marriage, the diary's revelations. Their shared enmity toward Cross forged a bond, turning strangers into allies. But tension mounted. Elias Ward, the deputy, arrived one night under cover of darkness, slipping through the shadows to warn them. Cross is suspicious of you, Mercer. He's spreading lies. Evelyn's a thief and attempted murderer. He's using his influence on the sheriff to issue warrants, and he's gathering men planning to search every homestead, including this one. Ward's face was grim, shadowed by his own grief. His sister had been one of Cross's victims years ago. I'll do what I can from inside, but you need to be ready. If you have that diary as proof, I left it behind, Evelyn confessed, regret heavy. Ward nodded. Then I'll try to get it, or a copy. But Cross is closing in. As Ward vanished into the night, Evelyn turned to Jonas, the Mothworn tearing at her. Run alone, risking the possible child, or stay and fight? We fight, Jonas said firmly. Together, they fortified the cabin. Barricades, hidden weapons, escape routes. But Cross's suspicion grew. Spies reported sightings near the cabin. One evening, as dusk fell, riders appeared on the horizon. Cross's men, encircling the property. The siege had begun. The night attack came swift and merciless. Cross's men, led by Travis Holt, stormed the cabin under cover of darkness, gunfire shattering the quiet desert air. Jonas positioned himself at the window, rifle barking precise shots that dropped two assailants before they reached the porch. Evelyn, heart pounding, crouched behind a barricade, her revolver steadied despite the fear clawing at her. When a thug burst through the back door, she fired her first kill. The man crumpled, blood pooling on the floor. The act shook her, but it proved her growth, from victim to fighter. As the battle raged, Elias Ward arrived with reinforcements. Townsfolk, weary of Cross's tyranny, armed with rifles and resolve. Ward carried evidence, a copied diary, smuggled by a sympathetic servant, along with testimonies from survivors of Cross's abuses. This ends tonight, Ward shouted, his men flanking the attackers, turning the tide. In the chaos, Jonas and Cross faced off in the yard. Cross, scarred and furious, sneered, "You should have let me die years ago, Mercer. Now I'll take everything from you, starting with her." Their duel was no mere gunfight. It was 7 years of pent-up vengeance. Cross drew first, but Jonas, faster, fueled by loss, shot him in the shoulder, disarming him. As Cross lunged with a knife, Ward's bullet felled him, ending the tyrant's reign in a pool of blood amid the dust. Dawn broke over the bloodied ground, survivors tending wounds as Ward's men rounded up the remnants of Cross's forces. Evelyn emerged from the cabin, revolver still in hand, eyes wide but unbroken. Jonas approached, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. "It's over," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded, placing a hand on her abdomen. The possible child now, a symbol of hope, not chains. They stood together, two shattered souls amid the wreckage, not yet in love, but bound by survival and shared scars. In each other they saw a chance for rebirth, a new life in the unforgiving desert, where wounds could heal and futures could bloom. The West was harsh, but for them, it promised renewal.